Thank you very much. It is indeed a great privilege and honor to be part of the Beijing Forum. And I will say in introducing that my short talk, I'm particularly pleased to follow Professor Wang because I will be saying things that are very congruent. I will take, however, as my text this morning, not Samuel Huntington, but Alan Bloom, for reasons of just opening up the palette a little more. And I'll try to be brief, given the press of time. When philosopher Alan Bloom wrote his infamous book, The Closing of the American Mind, from which I obviously take my title, it was declared in a number of contemporaneous reviews the first shot of the culture wars, namely a conflict that was taking place and went on throughout subsequent years to dominate the American Academy between those values considered in some ways traditionalist or conservative and those considered liberal or even radical. Bloom's book quickly generated an enormous debate in the United States about college life, about the place of the liberal arts, about, as Bloom himself put it in his book, the state of our soul. The book sold close to 500,000 copies in hardback. It was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 months, and it was reviewed in the New York Times as essential reading for anyone concerned with the state of liberal education in this society. It generated, in turn, a series of very critical reviews, including classicists and others who debunked both his characterizations of classical antiquity and of American higher education at the time. Now, 27 years on, it is hard as a humanist to avoid a peculiar feeling of nostalgia for the culture wars, given that all of the participants shared one thing in common, namely a concern about the importance of a humanist education. Back in the late 1980s, however, critics like Bloom were lambasting the 1960s generation, not only for their political radicalism as he saw it, but in fact more so for their flaccid moral and intellectual proclivity to openness and relativism. Now, I have to confess that Bloom's attack on the modern university was hard for me not to take personally, since he targeted in particular the two disciplines where I've held appointments for the last 40 years. As he wrote early on in his book, I quote, "Nature should be the standard by which we judge our own lives and the lives of people. That is why philosophy, not history or anthropology, is the most important human science." He equated history and anthropology, indeed, with the doctrine, as he saw it, of cultural relativism. History, in his view, should provide instead moral examples for emulation. The study of culture should affirm the transcendence of certain principles over others. Now, what of course he could not accept was, first, that the study of culture and civilization could be both critical and morally instructive. And second, that moral values were themselves necessarily rooted only in Western civilization. The popularity of his book was an expression, of course, of a deep-seated anxiety in the wake of the transformations of American academic and social life in the post-Vietnam War period, but it also reflected a fundamental refusal to accept that America had entered the world stage in the years during and after the Second World War. During that war, as the United States sent troops around the world, the U.S. also realized just how little knowledge it had about that world. After the war, U.S. universities began to invest heavily in what was called area studies, aided by support from private foundations as well as by the U.S. government for the study of world languages, cultures, histories, and the like, and often led by academics, in fact, who had worked during the war desperately to develop some level of global understanding for the purposes of the war effort. Experts in history, anthropology, political science, and classical world civilizations began to be trained in leading universities and then were hired across the country to teach the first courses of their kind to American undergraduates. I received my own education in South Asian studies in that precise context. And it was a time when there was a new openness to accepting not just the values of other civilizations, but the ways in which those values could shed light on what in some instances were seen as fundamental moral flaws in one's own traditions. This, of course, was part of what Alan Bloom reacted against so vigorously, though he had such a visceral attachment to a set of peculiar notions concerning Socratic Greece that he saw most acknowledgments of the importance of other parts of the world as new signs of further closings of the American mind. And yet, attacks on area studies came from other positions as well, including by scholars who alleged that scholarly work on the Orient worked both to praise the ancient civilizations of world regions, but in the context of asserting the fundamental necessity of Western scholarship to recover and interpret these traditions in ways that supported Western hegemony. Now, this new historicist work focused largely on colonialism as the principal modern context for the development of knowledge about the so-called Third World, and it showed how a great deal of Western knowledge about the East was to support, either implicitly or explicitly, Western rule. But historicist work had to be turned on its head when it began to be clear that the post-colonial nations were equally committed to their own traditions of civilizational preeminence, especially when secular values began to be rejected in some instances as Western rather than as autonomous values that could transcend their particular histories and become universal in their own way. Now, while the historicist work that was done was, in my view, a necessary coming-of-age experience for area studies as a form of Western knowledge, it also had the ironic effect of giving some measure of validity to at least one of Bloom's laments, by which I refer to his concern that moral education had become exclusively negative and insular. And all this coincided with the recognition that the world had become newly global, interconnected in ways and with a previously unimaginable velocity and force, which required more open, porous, dialogic, and productive engagements with other cultures, civilizations, peoples, and ideas. One way to interpret the culture wars in the United States, as with other culture wars doubtless in other places, is as an argument by proxy over how society should respond to globalization itself. Now, globalization has typically been studied as primarily about being about global financial flows, the interdependency of investments, markets, and economies, as well as the outsourcing of labor, of production, of infrastructural costs, and the like. Increasingly, especially with the easy scalability of new technology, globalization is about consumption as well as production. Also, there has been growing recognition of the extent to which major challenges such as terrorism, climate change, and global epidemics are indeed fundamentally all global. And yet, in all this invigoration of global interest, the study of history, culture, and society has been lagging seriously behind. This is in part the effect of the loss of the prestige of the liberal arts, in which, Bloom notwithstanding, the study of history, culture, and society is not just of critical importance for developing one's own sense of one's own civilization, but rather as well a sense of understanding the borderless character of world civilizations, to follow on from my distinguished predecessor. Fortunately, there are the beginnings of worldwide recognition that the liberal arts are key as well, not just for the development of sensitivities, perspectives, and skills that allow individuals to realize their own full human potential, but also as productive of the skills that foster originality, creativity, and success across all fields. Critical perspectives can be extended to global contexts without either reproducing colonial knowledge or disallowing moral debate. When American universities first began to introduce general education courses in fields such as Asian civilization in the post-war period, as part of the recognition of the need to introduce students to the existence of great and vibrant civilizations alongside the West, most American academics followed Max Weber and other European theorists to still believed that only Western civilization had been able to propel a full embrace of change from the Renaissance to the onset and advance of modernity. But this, of course, is all now being rethought, not least because of the great success of China in achieving sustained economic growth, urban transformation, and of course, the importance of its own history of world civilization over the last many years. Now, in the end, the crux of the issue in relationship to the writing of the history of civilizations, and we've just heard about that as well, is always, of course, the peculiar problems of history itself. The way history is often written by victors rather than victims, the extent to which the stories that are enshrined in official narratives of the past could be used, and often are used, to justify and legitimate rather than to question and critique. Nevertheless, history is too important and too contradictory to allow for any simple rewriting. Neither culture nor power worked in mechanical ways, to say the least. Each rewriting of history tells new stories in new contexts, in new ways. And that is why historical method and thought is always necessarily directed as much on itself as it is on the objects of study. The history of world civilizations is, in that context, at best, an accumulation of truths rather than a clash of cultures. It is about deconstructing the nature of the boundaries that constitute what we claim to study and showing the interactions over time, as well as the dynamism that flows from those interactions. Now, serious education in and engagement about global cultural traditions, beliefs, and worlds is also of fundamental significance when we consider the task of moving beyond general statements regarding global cosmopolitanism to trying to build new modes of cultural understanding, critical as we seek to design workable global economic, political, social, environmental institutions that can govern, manage, regulate, and intervene when necessary globally in ways that are considered to be legitimate, peaceful, and effective. What is perhaps most vitally needed in this context is a new way of thinking about global citizenship, how we must all participate in debating, devising, and deploying new modes of transnational governance itself. To do this, we may need an entirely new political and economic theory, a theory that is as inclusive of cultural difference as it is engaged with the task of building cultural dialogue. I believe we will only be able to develop adequate global theories if we design them together, that is, as part of a global intellectual and political project. The university is in some respects the most successful global institution we have, internationally positioned to create and disseminate knowledge that is path-breaking as well as critical, while being internally respected as it facilitates the genuine movement of global expertise and the global exchange of ideas. At the University of California in Berkeley, we are working to build a new global campus that will facilitate the kinds of interactions that will be critical to the success of any effort to further internationalize our universities. But in the process, we hope to convene intellectuals and ideas with the objective of creating not just new curricula, but new theories, new conventions, new ideas, and ultimately new practices. And that is the other reason why I'm here in Beijing, along with addressing you as part of the forum. As we think through these issues, we know, of course, that there are culture wars still, both here and around the world. Looking back, I think it is fair to say that the culture wars in the US were in large part about those who believed we should engage the world with humility and openness versus those who thought the US had little to learn from the outside world, certainly in the current environment. We could, in that view, teach the world without learning from it. Similar debates roil many countries that have inherited great traditions, and I'm sure it is true here as well. For what it might be worth, I think we should take culture and civilization seriously, never succumbing to the belief that we have all together moved into a world in which economic rationality can subsume cultural differences or perspectives going forward. I also believe, however, and in the spirit of productive cultural dialogue, that the winning side for all culture wars in the current age will be those who wish to engage the outside world with openness, with shared commitments around the importance of liberal learning and knowledge. In this project, it is my hope that global universities will play a fundamental role as they work with us and enable us to attempt to open minds across the world in hopes that together we can confront and perhaps even meet some of the global challenges and opportunities we face going forward. Thank you very much.